Start. This talk on yoga in Adhyatma Ramayana. I'm sure most of you who have been attending to this webinar will be quite familiar with So I will just be focusing on what exactly yoga is and how Adhyatma Ramayana looks at yoga. By the traditional spiritual thought currents, you realize that any path, any attitude goal will be slightly different, but that's not important. Important thing is you completely get out of worldliness. You completely get out of exclusiveness. How many paths can there be of realization? Mukti is realization. Any number of paths. For example, we find in Gita, there are 18 yogas mentioned. And there can be any number of yogas. What Swamiji did was, Swami Vivekananda, he organized these 18 or maybe many more just into 4. Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, Raj Yoga and Bhakti Yoga. If we put the whole thing in very simple terms, Jnana Yoga is when you discriminate between what is real and what is unreal. This is the simplest definition that we can give. Raj Yoga is when you try to calm your mental waves, and once you calm the mental waves, you know what the ultimate truth is. Tadadrashtu Swarupe Avasthanam. Karma Yoga is when you keep on working unselfishly, or you offer the fruits of all your action to God. It leads you to spiritual realization, mukti. And finally, there is Bhakti Yoga, where you have a chosen deity, your Ishta. You dedicate your life entirely and completely to your Ishta. And whatever happens is quite popular in Bhakti literature, where you slowly you start evolving and finally you become one with God. And becoming one with God has been described in different religious traditions variously, but that's not our subject. Right now we will be focusing only on yoga. By yoga we mean Raj Yoga, as Swamiji said, because the word yoga has been used so frequently that we might get confused, and hence the term is Raj Yoga. In praise of Raj Yoga, we can just say that it is the royal road to realization. Raj, it's like king, royal road to realization. Why? Because it's the practical aspect as well as demonstration of realization. There's no focus into it. I mean, someone who is following Raj Yoga sincerely, he cannot be cheated. To give you a very simple example, if you go by, say, Karma Yoga, we still don't know fully what are the pitfalls in Karma Yoga. It has not been elaborated the way it has been elaborated in Raj Yoga. Same with Bhakti Yoga. Even Bhakti Yoga, elaboration of the obstacles, and definitely not in Jnana Yoga. There are some here and there, but a systematic work is not there. But when you look at Raj Yoga, you find the entire thing, as you put, absolutely systematically. The main features of Raj Yoga. We are not discussing Raj Yoga in detail. We're just mentioning the main features. The first, most important aspect of Raj Yoga is Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Mind has waves, and these waves need to be calmed down. This is the most important aspect, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Now, those of you who are familiar with spiritual literature, you know that whether it be Jnana Yoga, or be it Bhakti Yoga, or be it Karma Yoga, ultimately it is Chitta Vritti Nirodha. In case of Bhakti Yoga, you focus your mind so much on God that all other vrittis go away. Similarly, in Karma Yoga, you identify yourself with universality. And the universality is so huge, the scope for limitedness goes away. In Jnana Yoga also, the same thing happens. You focus so much on the real, the ultimate, that everything that is trash, everything that is husk, it gets burned down. So, Chitta Vritti Nirodha is considered to be the only important thing in Raj Yoga. And when you look at spiritual life, whatever you go by, any religion, you go by any path, ultimately it is Chitta Vritti Nirodha. And in case of no Vritti Nirodha, say for example, we find people in this world who do not practice Chitta Vritti Nirodha, who are not in that state. For them, Vritti is the world. It's a huge subject, and we will not be entering too much into it because our topic is Yoga in Adhyatma Ramayana. I'm just giving you a brief outlay of this. How to do it. So there are 8 steps, Yam, Niyam, Asana, etc. However, Patanjali, the great teacher of yoga, beautifully says, Ishwar Pranidhanadva. You should put your mind entirely on God. Ishwar Pranidhan. Then you don't have to worry about all that. Once I had asked one of my teachers here, Ramakrishna Mission, we don't focus too much on Yam, Niyam, Asana, Pranayam, Pratyahar. So how do we expect to have Dharana, Dhyana, Samadhi? So he pointed out that no, it is about Ishwar Pranidhan. Who is Ishwar? It is Tasya Vachak Pranava. That is focusing on Om. However, the normal understanding that we have of Ishwar is not what yoga looks at Ishwar as. Ishwar is like Param Guru, is the Guru of Guru. He's not a creator God. He's not the controller. It's Prakriti that controls everything. And there is Karmasha. Every individual is carrying the load of his karma that needs to be expended. Philosophically speaking, there are 2 realities. Now, this is a very, very, very important thing. There is Purush and there is Prakriti. And both of them have absolute reality. Purush has a reality of its own. Prakriti has a reality of its own. And somehow Purush and Prakriti come together. There is this world, there is this universe, there is this existence. And now Purush is trapped. Purush needs to get out. Oh, it gets out, as we mentioned. There is Karmasha, there is Ishwar Pranidhan, and there is Tasya Vachak Pranava, holding on to Om. But when we look at yoga as a philosophy, mind you, not as a system of spiritual practices, because there simply cannot be a better system. Yoga is so beautifully organized. It very clearly tells what needs to be done when you're just beginning, for a beginner, and what happens as you keep on growing. What are the obstacles that you face, etc. And as we mentioned that ultimately, whatever path you take, whatever religion you follow, it's all about Chitta Vritti Nirodha. However, we have this serious problem of Prakriti being real. And from there, how Purusha and Prakriti come close, it's a mystery. And teachers of yoga, they have tried to explain it variously, but it's not very satisfactory. It cannot be. It just cannot be. The second problem is, can a common man who is entangled in the world and the worldly affairs, practice yoga? Can a person, he or she, practice Raj Yoga? Probably no. Well, then do you mean to say that yoga is not universal? When Swamiji is synthesizing the entire thing, harmonizing the whole thing, as you can see on the screen, the emblem of the Ramakrishna Mission, where he's talking about synthesis of yoga. Somewhere something is missing. And the link that is missing can be beautifully put together if we can somehow harmonize the whole thing as Swamiji did. Now, if you look at the scriptures that we have, starting from Ved through Puran and Mahabharata, Tantra, Smriti, etc., we find that there are three sacred books that stand out as books of synthesis. Well, that's my personal understanding. I mean, different scholars may see differently. First one of them is Gita. Gita harmonizes practically everything that was there available in those days in India. And then there is Adhyatma Ramayana. It harmonizes every possible spiritual path. Third, of course, is Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. If you really want to understand synthesis, if you want to know how Jnana Yoga and Raj Yoga can be harmonized, and for that matter, how Raj Yoga and Bhakti can be harmonized, and how all four can be harmonized, you find more or less in Gita, you find that in Adhyatma Ramayana, and you find in Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, Kathamrita. For example, we find Karma Yoga has been described in Gita in partly in second chapter, third chapter, and then we have Raj Yoga in the sixth chapter, and Bhakti Yoga is throughout, starting 7th chapter, particularly 10th, 11th, and then we have 10th, 11th, 12th. And then 13th chapter is exclusively devoted to Jnana Yoga, and 14th chapter is also on Jnana Yoga. So we find that in that small book that is only 700 verses, how all the four yogas have been put together and harmonized beautifully. And Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, those of you who have studied Kathamrita know this. Our topic is Adhyatma Ramayana. So we'll just mention you the genesis of Adhyatma Ramayana. Our Srimad Swami Atmapriyanji Maharaj asked me, because he has a special love for Adhyatma Ramayana. One reason being, Sri Ramakrishna used to take the name of this book quite a few times. In fact, there are many examples in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna which are straight from Adhyatma Ramayana. And Sri Ramakrishna had heard this Adhyatma Ramayana from Haldari, who used to reside at Dakshineshwar Kali temple. The story goes that Vyasa, he organized the Veda into 4 Vedas, Rig, Sam, Yajur, and Atharva. And then he wrote the great epic, Mahabharata. But somehow he was not happy, he was not content with himself. And then Narada met him and he told that, look, you have done great work, no doubt, but you have not narrated the story of the Lord. Now focus on the Lord. And then Vyasdev got down to writing Srimad Bhagavatam. And slowly, 18 Puranas came. Vyasa is credited with all those 18 Puranas. Swami Vivekananda has very beautifully said that later poets passed off their creation the name of Vyasa. So Vyasa is kind of a generic name. But we will not go for all those discussions. For us, it's sufficient that Vyasa wrote the 18 Puranas. Maybe he did not write all of them. Shankaracharya beautifully puts it. But what are Puranas? The old stories which are ever new. So, what Vyas had done, the great Ved Vyas, he knew all those stories and he wove those beautiful stories in some divine stories. Now, the speciality of Puran is that the divine beings play the central role and human characters are at the periphery. So, of these 18 Puranas, we have one Brahmanda Purana. In Brahmanda Purana, there is Uttar Kanda, there's a lighter section, and there we have complete Adhyatma Ramayana. You all know the story of Sri Ramachandra, and you know that how the great sage Valmiki, who is known as the first poet, beautifully composed Valmiki Ramayana. Valmiki Ramayana is considered the first epic in Sanskrit, in the sense that the Veda were there and the Veda were considered too sacred to be treated as any kind of poetic work. So, as far as human creation is concerned, and human creation that was studied is Valmiki Ramayana. Now, based on Valmiki Ramayana, which must have become quite popular, some other works came up, and much later we find Tulsidas wrote Ramacharita, which is very popular, and then there was Kamba Ramayana. But someone must have got it in his head to write absolutely the spiritual story of Sri Ramachandra. And in this spiritual story, every spiritual idea has been woven, particularly the synthesis of all these four yogas. The book begins with a conversation between Parvati and Shiva. Now, those of you who have studied Tulsidas' Ramacharita know that Tulsidas also took up the same style. The story is being narrated by Shiva to Parvati. He took this idea from Adhyatma Ramayana. In fact, Tulsidas' Ramacharita is more based on Adhyatma Ramayana than on Valmiki Ramayana. And Adhyatma Ramayana is a great spiritual work, great spiritual work. We have conducted Adhyatma Ramayana here at the university at the suggestion and insistence rather of Shiva Swami Atmapriyanjali Maharaj. We have this in Bengali, we have this in Hindi, some talks are available on YouTube. So, this is such a beautiful spiritual work where we find that Gyan, Bhakti, Yoga and action, Karma Yoga have been beautifully synthesized. Now, we mentioned that yoga has certain specialties like Chitta Vritti Nirodha, the concept of Purush, the concept of Prakriti, concept of Bhakti in the form of Ishwar Pranidhan, and ultimate Mukti, where Purush comes out of the snare of Prakriti. And there is a great problem of how Purush and Prakriti come together. And there is also the problem of, is this work that is yoga meant for common man? Adhyatma Ramayana addresses all this and takes care of all these problems and sorts it out. For example, as we mentioned that Parvati asked this question in Adhyatma Ramayana. She says, was Ram really God? She asks Lord Shiva. Because if Sri Ram was God, how could he shed tears for Sita? So he said, Mother Parvati says, some people say that Sri Ramchandra was just a very nice person when he made great sages and then he had realization. The idea being that Sri Ramchandra is just an ideal person who got self-realization. Lord Shiva beautifully narrates the real nature of Sri Ramchandra, which is one with God, which is one with Purush. Yatha prakashe natu vidyate रवो ज्योति स्वभावे परमेश्वरे तथा विशुद्ध विज्ञान घने रघुतमे अविद्या कथम स्यात् परता परात्मनि. Very beautifully describes the nature and character of Sri Ram. It is of God, which is the nature of Atman. Now, the fundamental difference between Purush of Yoga and Purush of, say, Upanishads is that in Upanishads, it's Advaita. It's only Atman, nothing else is there. You cannot call it one, you cannot call it two, you cannot call it zero. But in Yoga, you have multiplicity of Purusha, infinite number of Purusha. Whatever the number, the characteristics and the nature remains the same. What? Yatha aprakasho nato vidyate ravo. In the sun, you cannot imagine of any kind of darkness. Just like that. In Sri Ramchandra, you cannot imagine. It's practically sacrilege to think that Sri Ramchandra ever had any kind of avidya, had any kind of ignorance. For example, Purush of Rajyoga. Actually, it is never under the spell of ignorance. It appears as if it's under the spell of ignorance. Now, this appearance is so real that we think that it is real. And that is where yoga philosophy differs from, say, Vedanta, or even a book like Adhyatma Ramayana. Why? Because by very nature, Purush can never be under ignorance. So this world, this Maya, it all has to be an appearance. There's no way. Soyam Paratma Purusha Purana Ekaha Swayam Jyotir Ananta Abhyah Maya Tanum Lok Vimohaniyam Tatte Paranugraha Esha Rama. God is Atman. God is Atman. But appears through Maya as many. So you find clear departure from yoga. Then Soyam Paratma Purana Purusha. Purusha Purana. This concept of Purana Purusha we find in Upanishads, we also find in Gita. So we find slight deviation from the concept that we get from yoga. And when established in that nature of Purusha, Sri Ramchandra himself says in the second chapter of Adhyatma Ramayana, the Ayodhya Kand, Sarvatra Vigata Sneha, Mad Bhaktya Moksha Se Chira, Aham Sarvatra Samadrik Dveshyo Va Priya Eva Va. Sri Ramchandra says that anyone who becomes Vigata Sneha gets out of all attachments. All attachments. It means when a person is not under the spell of Maya, under the spell of Prakriti, he attains me. So, the concept of Ishwar Pranidhan that we have in yoga and Ishwar that we have in Adhyatma Ramayana, these are two different things. Changes because Ishwar in yoga is not a creator, is not the ultimate destiny. In Adhyatma Ramayana, it is. In Adhyatma Ramayana, the goal is to be one with God. So, Sri Ramchandra says, Mad Bhaktya. The concept of Ishwar Pranidhan continues, but the ultimate goal changes. So that's the nature of Purusha as we find in Adhyatma Ramayana. What is Swayam Paratma Purusha Purana Ekaha? He alone exists. Swayam Jyoti. This is a very important concept that we find in yoga also. Swayam Jyoti. It doesn't require the light of anyone. For example, Prakriti, although is independent, it has an independent existence, but it needs the light of Purusha. It gets lit up because Purusha is there. What is Prakriti? And how does it create the world? Says, no, I had the chance of having this, conducting adhyatma Ramayana class quite a few times. One of my very favorite shlokas, since the beginning itself, first, that is, Balkand in the introduction itself, in the first chapter, verse number 43, Ramo na gacchati, na tishtati, nanu sochati, akanchate, tyajati, no na karoti kinchit. Ramchandra. It doesn't walk, it doesn't sit, it doesn't go anywhere. Neither he thinks nor he laments. Neither he gives up anything, nor does he do anything. This is, well, when we think of God through, say, Bhakti literature, we always think that God is looking after us. We say that God is one who grants the prayers, fulfills the prayers of a devotee. Acharya Shankar also says that. But Sita, this statement is from Mother Sita, who narrates. No, this is from, sorry, Lord Shiva. Ramana gacchati na tishtati na sochati akanchate tajati no na karoti. Ram doesn't do anything. Ananda Murti is Ananda Murti, achalaha, doesn't move. Parinam, you know, it never undergoes any kind of transformation. Transformation is a typical characteristic of Prakriti. This is the nature of Purusha. There is never any transformation. It doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't do anything. It is just there. So, it says, Tat sanidhyan maya shishtam. Mother Sita says beautifully, I am Prakriti. Mother Sita is telling, Tat sanidhyan maya shishtam. Tasmin arupyate abudhaye. Mother Sita is describing it to Adi Hanuman. Sri Ramchandra said that, okay, you explain the mystery of creation. Mother Sita says that, look, Ram doesn't do anything. I do everything. I do everything. Whatever has happened, and then there is a huge narration. But whatever Sri Ramchandra did, for example, when he killed Taraka and when he broke that great vow, and then he killed Ravan and all those things, he didn't do anything. I did everything. This is a very, very, very interesting verse because it fits absolutely with the concept of Prakriti in Raj Yoga. In Raj Yoga, Prakriti does everything. Prakriti does everything. People think that Purusha is doing. And this exactly is what Mother Sita said. Sminaro Pete Budhaye. Or Budhaye, those who are ignorant, they think that Sri Ramchandra is doing all that. No, Sri Ramchandra doesn't do. Why? Because Ramo na gacchati na tishtati. Ram doesn't go anywhere, Ram doesn't do anything. It's me who does everything. What? Ayodhya Nagare Janma Raghu Vakshayati Nishmade. The very birth of Sri Ramchandra in Ayodhya was not there. I did it. This concept we find in Tantra also. In Tantra also, Shiva is of course there telling. We find in Mahan Nirvan Tantra tells that, oh mother, telling Parvati, it's because of you that all we, like Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, have come into effect. So how Purusha and Prakriti are related? According to Adhyatma Ramayana, Anandam Nirmalam Shantam Nirvikaram Niranjanam Sarva Vyapinam Atmanam Swa Prakasham Akalvasham. This is the nature of Purusha. Establishing its own joy. pure, shanta. There is no kind of disturbance, there is no kind of motion. And compared to that, Mother Sita says, Manga Vidhi Moola Prakritim Sarga Sthiti Atyanta Karini. Know me. He's saying, Mami Hanuman. Know me to be the Moola Prakriti. Now, instead of Prakriti, the term used is Moola Prakriti. The original cause of all this creation. She says, the root cause of creation, sustenance, and destruction is me. How? Tasya sannidhi matrena. And that very interesting concept. And the very proximity of Purusha and Prakriti. Now, this is, as we mentioned here in earlier, we mentioned earlier also. This is Tat Sannidhi. This concept Tat Sannidhi comes repeatedly in Adhyatma Ramayana. It says that Purusha and Prakriti, when they come near. Now, when we think how Purusha and Prakriti come near, it becomes quite interesting because Rajyoga doesn't have a very clear answer. But if you go by Adhyatma Ramayana, it becomes slightly easy to comprehend. Sri Ramachandra and Sita, one is Moola Prakriti and there is Purusha. Because Purusha is there and this Purusha is one, so there is no multiplicity. Multiplicity appears simply because Prakriti is there. So there is a slight difference between Yoga and Adhyatma Ramayana, the concept of Purusha between these two. But Tasya Sannidhi Matrena, very clearly says Tasya Sannidhi Matrena. So this is not one of those typical our concept that we have in Tantra where Shiva and Shakti are two eternally reality, to eternal reality. Here, Sita is very clear that I do everything. So, on the one hand, we find that Sri Ramachandra and Sita, they are one. At the same time, we find that they have independent reality. So much so that Sita says, Ram does nothing, I do everything. There is not one off. Narad comes to meet Sri Ramachandra. Kind of reading Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Narad comes and prays. So, Sannikarsa Jayate Tasya Brahmadaya Praja. So, Ashaya Sadavati Mayaya Trigunatmika. Narad is praying to Sri Ramachandra. Lord, it is because of your proximity with Maya, which is Trigunatmika, that Brahma, etc., are used. And famous sentence, famous statement we come across in Kathamrita. Loke Sri Vachakam Yavatta Sarvam Janaki Shubha. Punnam Vachakam Yavatta Sarvam Tamhi Raghava. O Lord Rama. Wherever there is masculine anything that is represented by the gender masculine is you. Anything feminine is Mother Sita. Now, this is a complete departure from everything that we know. Everything that we know. Now, when we talk about Purusha and Prakriti, very often people think that Purusha means Purusha the gender, Prakriti means female. This is one concept that is missing completely from in yoga philosophy, according to yoga. Purusha means consciousness and Prakriti is energy. Consciousness, energy. When these two come together, there is this creation. But Adhyatma Ramayana makes a complete departure, and yet we can see how much of similarity is there. It says, Sri Vachakam Yavat Tat Sarvam Janaki Shubha. Interestingly, our Agastya Muni tells Sri Rama, Mula Prakriti Teke Prahur Mayati Keshana Avidya Sanskriti Bandha Ityadi Bhodochate. This is something which you don't find anywhere other than here and there, say the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Since when Maya covers Brahman, it is avyakrit. And some call it Mula Prakriti, some call it Maya, some call it Avidya, some call it Sangsriti, some call it Bandhan. This is third chapter, third section, fourth chapter, verse number 22, which is very, very, very important concept. See, this problem of harmony, synthesis of these parts, we have been discussing as Swamiji talked about harmony of four yogas. How do you harmonize it? Because we know that in yoga, Purus and Prakriti, they have independent reality. They are completely separate and they have absolute reality of their selves. But Vedanta will not accept that. In Vedanta, Prakriti, rather Maya, is entirely dependent only on Brahman. And it doesn't have absolute reality. But Sage Agastya says that Mool Prakriti Rityeke Prahur Mayati Keshavi. Adhyatma Ramayana harmonizes all these different concepts. It says Maya, Prakriti, Avidya, Sangshriti, Bandhan. These are all one and the same. This is extremely debated, and those who are deeper into philosophy, particularly spiritual philosophy, will argue that if you say that all these are one, well, then the very concept of you, where Prakriti has an independent existence, it is an independent reality, it gets compromised. Actually, it doesn't get compromised. If you go deeper, you realize that the whole of spiritual world, every religion that we have, has this problem of multiplicity. For example, those of you who have studied Sri Ramakrishna's biography, or even say Kathamritu, know that when Sri Ramakrishna did sadhana, first he had Mother Kali. And then when Totapuri came, Sri Ramakrishna went for Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and he attained that. In that Nirvikalpa Samadhi, as Sri Ramakrishna used to talk repeatedly, Advaitam, the ultimate reality, where there is neither one nor two. And he taught Narendra Datta, like Swami Vivekananda, how if you have 10 pots with water, with sun reflecting, you have 11 sun. And when you go on breaking one pot after another, only one is left, you have two. And if you break the last one, how many sun remain? Swamiji, as viewed answer, said one. Shaka said, no, you cannot say, because there is no one to say what remains. This is Advaita. Now, naturally, talking about the ultimate reality, when we say that Purus and Prakriti are real, this standpoint of yoga, of course, it's not a philosophy as such by yoga. It's borrowed from Sankhya, and that's why Sankhya and yoga are twin philosophies. So when yoga says that Purus and Prakriti are two independent realities with their absolute existence, well, it's slightly difficult to say, because when you say that Chitta Vritti Nirodha, very Chitta Vritti Nirodha, that his mind has stopped functioning completely. How can you say how many realities are there? It's actually a very simple argument. I find it very interesting. And somewhere, it has been compromised. What exactly happens after Chitta Vritti Nirodha? When you compromise it with what you see in this world of Chitta. So we have this empire of mind, and there is this empire which is beyond this mind and beyond. On the one hand, when we are talking about Chitta Vritti Nirodha, Tadadrashtu Swarupe Avasthana, it's Swarup Avasthana. At the same time, we are talking about multiplicity. That must be the only reason why yoga talks about both Purus and Prakriti. But As Vedanta says, because Adhyatma Ramayana belongs to Puran, and Puran are in harmony with Upanishads. And Puran will always be nearer to the Upanishads than any other system of thought. As I said, Adhyatma Ramayana is a work of synthesis. And because it's a work of synthesis, it tries to bring all these thought processes on one single platform. And second very important thing in that very chapter is Rama Maya Vidha Bhati Vidya Avidyeti Te Sada. Sri Ramakrishna repeatedly talked about Vidya Shakti, Avidya Shakti. Agastya Muni says, Ram Maya Vidha Bhati. Now, the sage is not talking about Shakti, he's talking about Maya. But he has already earlier said Mula Prakriti, Maya, Avidya, in fact, Shakti. They're all one and the same. Till you are looking at multiplicity. When you are aware of multiplicity, when you see multiplicity, you can call it by any name. Multiplicity is Maya, multiplicity is Prakriti, multiplicity is because of energy, multiplicity is because of Shakti. You can say any of these things. And says Ram, Maya, Vidha Bhati, Vidya, Avidyeti, Te Sada. Adhyatma Ramayana talks about Maya. Thakur used to say Shakti. What? Pravritti Marga Nirata and Nivritti Marga Nirata. That which takes you towards Pravritti Marga. It was a word. This is Avidya. And that which takes you towards liberation. That is Vidya, Avidya and Vidya. Nivritti Marga Nirata, Vedanta Artha Vicharaka. The tendencies, the forces that take you more and more towards Vedanta, Artha, Vedanta, Vichara. Towards Vedanta. That is Nivritti. That is Vidya. So we have very clear distinction of Shakti or Maya or Avidya as two. This is something very unusual because even in Vedanta we don't come across this. And not even in yoga, definitely not in yoga, because in yoga we have only Prakriti. But Adhyatma Ramayana makes a complete departure from both these aspects and says, we have these two. Sri Ramakrishna repeatedly talked about these two, Vidya and Vidya Shakti, Vidya Shakti. And there is this problem of consciousness. It says, Jadasya Chit Samayoga Chitvam Bhuya Chitte Satha. Jada Sanga Jadatwami Jalagniyor Melanam Yatha. If you have a hot iron ball and you put it in water, the properties get exchanged. The hot ball becomes slightly cool, water becomes slightly hot. So when Jada and Chetan, Prakriti and Purush come together, the properties get superimposed. Now Purush starts behaving like Prakriti. Prakriti starts behaving like Purush. This is something we find in yoga also, where when Purush and Prakriti come together, Purush starts thinking that it's under bondage, and Prakriti starts thinking that it has consciousness. The very definition in Sankhya Yoga of Purush and Prakriti is Purush cannot act, and Prakriti is insentient. The moment they come together, here it says, Sri Ramchandra being God, Sita being his power. This power is insentient by its own, by its very nature. But because Sri Ramchandra is there, it appears conscious. And in this world, same thing happens. Because Purush is there, the soul is there, the conscious nature of soul is superimposed on the mind. So Jada appears now as Chetan. Sabhas buddhi kartritvam avichinya vikarine. Buddhi works with chill avhas. It's the intellect that's working. How? Through borrowed intelligence, through borrowed consciousness. But people think that it's Atman that is doing all this. This is the concept that we have in Vedanta. and concept that we have in yoga too. So there is another sloka that says, God lights up the buddhi. But ultimately its goal is mukti. Goal of yoga is mukti. Goal of jnana is mukti. Goal of Gita is mukti. The goal of adhyatma Ramayana is mukti. What is bondage? Karoti dukhen hi karmatantram sharir bhogartam aharnisham dara. People run after enjoyment simply because they treat body as Atman. We think Prakriti is Purush. We think this world to be conscious. We think our body to be conscious. We think body is Atman. That's why we suffer. So how to do it? Karmasha has to be extended. Karmasha, the huge talk of karma that we carry on our back. How? In yoga, we have a very clear definition of avidya, asmita, raga, dvesh, abhinivesh. They need to be, ultimately it's a raga, dvesh. Sri Ramchandra very beautifully teaches Lakshman. In Ayodhya Kand, when Lakshman is furious, his father has done injustice to us. He says, Name bhoga game vamcha, name bhoga vivarjani. This is ultimate of Vedanta actually. Anyone who wants chitta vritti nirodha, as yoga expects us to do, chitta vritti, mental waves. Mental waves come simply because there is some impulse, some kind of impetus. Swamiji beautifully puts it. There's think of a calm lake and you throw stone. The moment you throw stone, there is a reaction from water that appears as a wave. Just like that, we have mental waves. And these mental waves are what? Because of rag and dvesh. Rag is sukham shairaga. Thing that you love. Shri Ramchandra says, no. I'm beyond it. What? Name bhoga game vamcha. I don't have any desire to run after enjoyment. Nor do I run away from. Swamiji had very beautifully put it. Avoid not, seek not. Sri Ramchandra, he is not running away from enjoyment. Nor he is running after enjoyment. Agachattvata mam agachatva bhoga vashvo bhavet. Whether they come, whether they go, it doesn't matter. Because we are never under vogue of karma. Karma is not forcing. That's what Sri Ramchandra says. How to do it? Like we mentioned, yama, niyama, asana. Here, our Adhyatma Ramayana again makes a departure. Actually, what happens in yoga, the first verse, first sutra is Atha Yoga Anushasana. Now, when we talk about Atha, now, essentially it means the preparation. That means, how do you begin? Where to begin? Although we come across yama, niyama, these two very important practices, but somehow, when Raj Yoga talks about ahimsa, satya, steya, brahmacharya, aparigraha, sounds a bit high. Adhyatma Ramayana makes it easier. Sri Ramchandra tells Shabari, famous character, was a traveler, a man who had great devotion to Shyama. Says, Satan Sangati Evatra Sadhanam Pratham Smritam. First is Sadhu Sangha. Sri Ramakrishna repeatedly used to say, as I mentioned that Thakur said, has a lot of similarity. Adhyatma Ramayana. Satan Sangati Eva Atra Sadhanam Prathamam. First Sadhu Sangha. And Dityam Mad Katha Lapas. Tityam Mad Gune Pranam. You talk about God and you need to go deeper and deeper. And then expansion to this. That means talking about God. And then Acharya Upasana, Upasana of Acharya, to serve your teacher. Panchamam Punya Shilatvam Yamadi Niyamadi Cha. Yam and Niyam come after that is. As I mentioned in the beginning, I had one of our senior teachers that we don't practice Yam and Niyam in Ramakrishna mission. So how do we expect to grow in yoga? I was not wrong. Because as Adhyatma Ramayana says that it begins with holy company. Sri Ramakrishna repeatedly says Sadhu Sangha, Sadhu Sangha, Sadhu Sangha. And then you go into scriptures. I don't mean to, praise so much, but I have no option. Our Swami Samarpanananda Maharaj, when he started this university, he was continuously focusing on this. That words of God, words of scriptures need to be spread. The devotees of Ramakrishna, those who are associated with the Ramakrishna mission, they have holy company, no doubt about it. But what about the next step? Now, if people simply start aspiring for God realization, how can you? You need to go through these steps. Yam, Niyam, Asana, Pranayam. How to go to Yam, Niyam? Is holy company enough? According to Adhyatma Ramayana, no. There are steps. You need to get into scriptures. You need to study. You need to think. You need to discuss. And then you are fit for Ahimsa Satyam Asteya. This is, I don't say it's a departure from yoga philosophy, yoga outlook, but it adds beautiful steps, makes the climbing so softer. And how? Says, Tona mantra japya vimukhesu tanos maya. Japa is the way out. When you do japam, then only you can cross maya. And what is that maya? Deho ahamiti ya buddhir avidya sa prakirtita. When you think that you are this body, you are in avidya. Naham deha chilapiti. I am not this body, I am pure atma. Jnana means I am not this body. How do you go? Practice Yam and Niyam. Before Yam Niyam, you practice Sadhu Sangha, Shastra Shravana, Shastra Manan, etc. And then Yam Niyam, etc. And what happens then? Says, avidya merges in Paramatma when the jnana comes. Atmano jiva pariyor mula vidya tadevi liyate karya karane seva paramatmani. There is this theoretical understanding, thorough theoretical understanding, and then you have practical realization of all this. And this is known as Vigyan. Vigyan is, in that state, this mula avidya, prakriti, it merges into Atma. Again, it makes a departure. So we find how that makes departure, but this moving away from you is actually harmonizing you. The two problems that we faced, how Purusha and Prakriti come together, etc., and the related questions. And can yoga be practiced by a common man? The moment we take in Adhyatma Ramayana, the outlook and philosophy of Adhyatma Ramayana, whole thing becomes very smooth. Because Adhyatma Ramayana says, Bhakti is the way out. Once you are into all this, happens. One very interesting thing about Adhyatma Ramayana is very unusual. Concept of Vairabhav. Sri Ramakrishna also mentions Vairabhav. You're continuously thinking. You have enmity towards God, and you are continuously thinking about God because you have enmity towards God. For example, Kamsa was there and Ravana was there. But what is Vairabhav? You are continuously thinking, and through your continuous thinking, your chitta, the vritti that you have, it stops. Instead, You have a constant remembrance of God, but it is undimmed. Even in Adhyatma Ramayana, Mahavir Hanuman cautions Ravana, says, this is not a valid path to realization, don't practice it. So just to sum up, my time is up. But if you look at Adhyatma Ramayana, and when you look at Adhyatma Ramayana from the standpoint of yoga, you'll find there are similarities, you'll find there are dissimilarities. You'll feel that the whole thing is being harmonized, you'll feel that it is deviating. But I've always felt that, and it's not only because of this talk, it's quite a few years ago when I realized that actually, as far as yoga is concerned, Adhyatma Ramayana makes it complete spiritually. Philosophically, well, questions may be raised. As far as practices are concerned, questions may be raised. But when you have a pure spiritual outlook, when goal is mukti, and goal is liberation, and the very yoga philosophy, of course, it's a spiritual philosophy. After all, it belongs to one of the 6 systems of philosophy, Sadhadarsa. However, the little gaps that we find in yoga, which have been filled up by the commentators, and there have been great commentators, however, Adhyatma Ramayana, as an independent work, fills those gaps. And I must say that yoga then appears as a complete spiritual work.